I've always loved the serenity of hunting season. It's woven into the very fabric of life in my small, rural community, a place where everyone knows your name and what you've been up to. Nestled in the heart of a wide valley, bounded by craggy mountains on one side and endless farmland on the other, our town sits about 3 hours from anywhere significant. There are only about 200 souls spread out here, living in houses that often take a bit of a drive to reach. Folks generally keep their doors unlocked in the daytime, wave at passing cars even when they don't recognize the drivers, and check in on neighbors at the first sign of trouble. I was born and raised here, and I never thought something could truly scare me on this land until the fall of 2016, when I discovered just how wrong I was. A chilly October evening. It was the first week of October, the designated time for rifle mule deer buck hunting in our state. There's a strong culture of sustenance hunting here, and once again I was lucky enough to draw a coveted buck tag. Usually, it's an event our family anticipates all year. The planning, the scouting, the thrill of possibly stocking our freezer for the winter. My grandmother has a large farm that's a prime hunting spot. She allows only family to hunt her land, and that evening, I had it all to myself, at least, so I believed. My husband, Brandon, had originally planned to join me. I'm on the smaller side, and if I managed to bag a deer, I knew I'd want help packing out the meat. But a last-minute work obligation kept him at the office. I considered canceling, but the day was too perfect to pass up. The sky was an endless stretch of crisp autumn blue. The light breeze carried the unmistakable scent of drying corn and turned leaves, and the deer had been moving around quite a bit lately. I had scouted earlier in the week, found plenty of fresh tracks along the tree line, and even spotted a few good bucks at a distance. The odds seemed in my favor. I still remember how that cool, late afternoon sun felt on my face as I laced my boots. The air smelled of hay, corn husks, and that faint tang of the nearby river. I grabbed my rifle, slipped a pair of binoculars around my neck, and tucked my cell phone into my jacket pocket. As I climbed into my old, trusty Jeep, a shiver of anticipation ran through me. The day felt right. I set off on the dirt roads that wind through our valley. With harvest season nearly done, most of the fields were stripped bare, but my grandmother's farmland was special. She grew corn that towered over my head, a lush alfalfa field close to the water, and beyond those green rows, the broad river meandered by. Between the farm and the river stood a line of old-growth cottonwood and willow trees, gnarled trunks that had seen more decades than I could guess. On the other side of those trees, a gentle slope led to the river's muddy banks. Around sunset, the whole place turned golden and magical, the kind of landscape that made me feel safe and comforted. But that day would prove it could also morph into a realm of hidden threats and suffocating dread. 2. Arriving at the farm. When I reached the usual dirt turnout about a mile upstream from the fields, I pulled over and parked. My grandmother and I had talked earlier in the day. She'd assured me no one else had permission to hunt that night. I locked the Jeep more out of habit than necessity. Everyone here tends to leave their vehicles unlocked, but a flicker of caution tugged at me. It was probably just nerves about hunting alone at dusk, I told myself. When I reached the usual dirt turnout about a mile upstream from the fields, I pulled over and parked. My grandmother and I had talked earlier in the day. She'd assured me no one else had permission to hunt that night. I locked the Jeep more out of habit than necessity. Everyone here tends to leave their vehicles unlocked, but a flicker of caution tugged at me. It was probably just nerves about hunting alone at dusk, I told myself. Rifle slung over my shoulder, I stepped onto the narrow trail that runs parallel to the river. The ground was soft from recent irrigation, and my boots sank a little into the mud. Each footstep was accompanied by the squish of damp earth, the rustle of drying grass, and the gentle hush of flowing water just beyond the tree line. The sky was beginning to shift in color, the sun dipping lower, painting the distant horizon in shades of pink and orange. I walked for about 20 minutes, scanning the edge of the alfalfa field through my binoculars occasionally. The plan was simple: to position myself on the downwind side, wait until dusk, and hope a big buck wandered out from the cover of the corn or the trees. My grandmother's sprawling haystack lay at the far end of the field, a huge mound of stacked alfalfa bales that provided good shelter for wildlife. Sometimes the deer lingered near it, nibbling stray alfalfa or bedded down in the shadows. It was a perfect place to keep watch. As I drew closer, the massive shape of the haystack came into view, a monolith of golden bales rising against the darkening sky. A chill breeze slid across my neck, and despite the normalcy of it all, a strange prickle of unease passed over me. I paused, inhaled deeply, then pressed my binoculars to my eyes. At first, I saw nothing but the quiet farmland, tall grass near the tree line, the trimmed edge of the alfalfa field, and the neatly stacked bales. But as I slowly swept the binoculars to the left, my breath caught in my throat. Emerging from behind the haystack was a large man, tall, broad-shouldered, and moving with an unsettling sense of purpose. He wasn't just strolling. He was striding toward me with what looked like single-minded determination. Even from a few hundred yards away, the sight of him made every hair on the back of my neck stand on end. A jolt of alarm stabbed through my chest. This man was not anyone I recognized, and in our tiny town, that alone was unusual. If my grandmother said I was the only one who had permission to hunt, then who was this stranger, and what was he doing on her land? 3. The growing unease. I instinctively crouched down among the tall, dry grasses at the field's edge, struggling to keep my breathing calm. My boots pressed into the muddy soil, making my stance unsteady. But I forced myself to remain still. I could see him more clearly now through the binoculars. He wore filthy, tattered clothing, the fabric stained with grime and what might have been dried blood. His hair and beard were unkempt, as though he'd been living rough for quite some time. A deep dread lodged itself in my mind. My rational side tried to conjure an explanation. Maybe he was a drifter or a lost hunter. However, intuition screamed that something was terribly off. He moved too purposefully to be lost, and the farm was way too far from any major road for it to be a simple wrong turn. My Jeep was a mile away behind me, near the upstream corner of the property. The man was already between me and the haystack, my intended vantage point. Instead of continuing forward, I decided to backtrack toward my Jeep. In my head, I ran through possibilities. Maybe I could drive around the fields, scout the area from a safer vantage, or simply head home and alert my grandmother. But as soon as I began moving, I realized with a sinking heart that his strides were quickly eating up the distance. Short as I am, I doubted I could outpace him on foot. It was only late afternoon, but twilight was fast approaching, and the looming darkness filled me with urgency. The last thing I wanted was to be stuck out here, alone with a stranger who radiated menace. My Jeep was a mile away behind me, near the upstream corner of the property. The man was already between me and the haystack, my intended vantage point. Instead of continuing forward, I decided to backtrack toward my Jeep. In my head, I ran through possibilities. Maybe I could drive around the fields, scout the area from a safer vantage, or simply head home and alert my grandmother. But as soon as I began moving, I realized with a sinking heart that his strides were quickly eating up the distance. Short as I am, I doubted I could outpace him on foot. It was only late afternoon, but twilight was fast approaching, and the looming darkness filled me with urgency. The last thing I wanted was to be stuck out here, alone with a stranger who radiated menace. I turned, scanning toward the river, considering if I could slip across it to the opposite bank. I reached the edge, but the water was high and the mud thick. I sank to my ankles just testing it. With one foot, no way. Trying to cross would be not only messy and slow, but dangerous. One misstep, and I could be dragged into deeper water. My phone. Maybe there was enough of a signal to call my husband or the sheriff. I crouched, lower, heart thumping, as the man disappeared for a moment behind a slight rise in the field, a spot where a shallow drainage ditch cut through. That was my chance. I ducked into the thick rows of cornstalks, hoping the rustle of leaves wouldn't give me away. The dryness of the stalks made them crackle loudly with every movement, and I inwardly cursed the noise. Shaking fingers rummaged in my jacket pocket, retrieving my phone. I swiped to unlock it, and saw, with dread, that there was no signal. The tower was 30 miles away across rough terrain. Sometimes we could make calls from the orchard near the farmhouse, but out here, near the river, the phone was practically useless. That was when I heard it, the snap of cornstalks snapping underfoot and the low, hoarse voice of the stranger, pitched with anger and desperation. He was so close. My skin prickled. For the stranger in the corn. My pulse hammered in my ears. I tucked my phone away, knowing that no call would connect. Slowly, I peeked between the cornstalks. I could see him now at about 100 yards away, scanning the field with wild, furious eyes. My stomach lurched. He was so tall, easily a foot taller than me, with broad shoulders that could overpower me in an instant if he got close enough. Suddenly he yelled, "Where the fuck did you go?" His voice tore the silence like a knife, and I felt an instinctive jolt of fear. He ripped out a cornstalk, flinging it aside. I cowered lower, my eyes on his every movement. There was a manic quality to him, an edge that had nothing to do with normal hunting frustration. I realized with a wave of relief that he didn't appear to have a rifle. But that relief was short-lived. The man was plenty dangerous without a firearm, judging by his size and obvious rage. The sun was dipping ever lower, setting the tops of the cornstalks ablaze with orange light. Soon, night would cloak the entire area in darkness, and I'd lose any advantage of sight. The idea of being out here alone, with no cell reception, gave me a sickening twist in my gut. As quietly as I could, I pulled the bolt on my rifle to ensure a round was chambered, then flicked the safety on. I prayed I wouldn't have to use it. The very thought of pulling the trigger on a person made my blood run cold. Never in my life had I wanted to harm anyone. But in that moment, I promised myself if it came down to my life or his, I'd do whatever I had to do. Time crawled by as I debated. The cornstalks were thick, but if he decided to thrash around, he might find me just by chance. My attempts at calling for help had failed. Could I wait him out? Could I circle back stealthily? He was so unpredictable, and I knew if he caught me, I'd stand little chance in a physical struggle. Time crawled by as I debated. The cornstalks were thick, but if he decided to thrash around, he might find me just by chance. My attempts at calling for help had failed. Could I wait him out? Could I circle back stealthily? He was so unpredictable, and I knew if he caught me, I'd stand little chance in a physical struggle. Then I noticed something. The man was circling around, pacing as if searching for me. Now or never. In a rush of adrenaline, I stepped out of the corn, revealing myself, hoping to de-escalate the situation. After all, I worked in healthcare, dealing with mentally unstable individuals every day. I knew how to keep my voice calm, how to show empathy without letting my own fear take over. Maybe I could talk him down, or at least send him on his way. I emerged into a narrow clearing between rows of corn, making sure to keep at least 80 yards between us. His head whipped around, eyes locking onto me. The smell hit me almost before the breeze even shifted, an overpowering reek of sweat, stale body odor, and something metallic. His face, partially shadowed by the low sun, was twisted in rage or confusion. Half of his features seemed slack, as though he'd had a stroke or some kind of paralysis. His mouth slurred at the corner, drool mixing with dirt on his chin. "Hi," I said, voice wavering despite my best efforts. "I'm sorry if I interrupted your hunt work, or intruded on you somehow. I didn't mean any harm." He glared at me with an intensity that made my hands tremble. Then he roared, "There you fucking are!" With a quick lunge, he snatched up a massive branch, a thick piece of driftwood or a broken limb from a tree. It looked at least 5 feet long, a crude club big enough to kill someone if he swung it hard. Instinctively, I dropped to one knee, raised my rifle, and flicked the safety off. "Stop!" I shouted, voice cracking slightly. "Stay where you are!" He halted, his chest heaving as he squeezed the branch in a shaking grip. For a frozen moment, neither of us spoke. The wind hissed through the corn, carrying the faint chorus of crickets. Then he broke the silence, voice trembling with rage. "Do you know whose farm this is?" he demanded, spittle flying from his mouth. A dribble of saliva trailed down his chin. I forced an even tone. "Yes, this is my grandmother's farm. I've hunted it my whole life. I'm sorry if..." He cut me off, veins bulging at his temples. "No, this is not your farm. This land belongs to me and my wife, you stupid bitch." He flung a hand in the direction of the haystack. "She was hunting out here. We had a huge buck lined up, and you ruined it." I noticed dark stains on his shirt. Now that I was closer, it did look like dried blood, but I couldn't tell if it was his own or from something else. My stomach churned. The stench rolling off him was nearly suffocating, a mix of excrement and decay. The slur in his speech grew thicker the more upset he became, and as he shouted, I could hear his breath whistling through clenched teeth. I haven't seen anyone else hunting here," I managed. My eyes darted left and right, scanning for any sign of another presence. A woman, perhaps. But there was no one. Just him. I haven't seen anyone else hunting here," I managed. My eyes darted left and right, scanning for any sign of another presence. A woman, perhaps. But there was no one. Just him. "You ruined our hunt," he bellowed. He sounded almost animalistic, a deep, guttural growl. That made my skin crawl. Then, without warning, he let out a sharp yell and lunged forward. I stood, heart hammering, and steadied the rifle, aiming at center mass. My finger hovered over the trigger. "Stop! I will shoot if I have to." He froze mid-lunge, glaring at me as if assessing whether I meant it. My body trembled with fear and adrenaline. I had never aimed a gun at a person before, and every fiber of my being recoiled at the possibility of shooting him. But the alternative Being beaten to death by that massive stick was more terrifying still. For a long, tense moment, we locked eyes. I could see pure hatred twisting his features, as if every bit of sanity was slipping away. Then, abruptly, he let the branch drop. It tumbled into the dirt with a hollow thud. He stood there, panting, eyes wild. "Listen," I said, my voice coming out shaky. "I don't want anyone getting hurt. I'm sorry if I messed up your hunt, but I need you to turn around and leave, and I'll leave too. No trouble." He stared at me, eyes darting left and right, as though checking to see if I was alone. The seconds dragged on like hours. At last, he grunted a low, vile sound from the back of his throat. He mumbled something. "Fine," was all I caught, and then he turned, stomping away through the brush, heading back toward the haystack. I stood there, rifle raised, not daring to lower it until his towering form vanished behind a rise. 5. Into the gloom. Relief flooded me, nearly knocking me off balance. But I knew better than to relax completely. My mind was screaming at me not to lose sight of him, not to trust that he would just leave. I edged back into the rows of corn, the cool leaves brushing my cheeks. The last thing I wanted was to have him double back and catch me in the open. Peering through the stalks, I watched him weave his way toward the haystack. His steps were furious and quick, as if the very ground offended him. Dust shadows deepened across the field, making it harder to see. My binoculars trembled in my hands as I lifted them to my eyes. I glimpsed him stepping into a small lot near the haystack, then crouching behind something, perhaps rummaging. My heart thudded. His mention of a wife out here hunting with him made no sense. I had a clear view of the entire field from where I'd hidden. If there had been a second person, a woman, she would have been visible at some point. Yet I saw no one. The man reemerged, heading to a small, beat-up white car parked by the stacked bales. I tried to make out the license plate, but the angle was all wrong. He flung open the driver's side door, climbed in, and slammed it shut with such force I heard the echo even from my vantage point. Seconds later, the engine roared, tires spitting dust and gravel as he peeled out of there, heading for the dirt road. As the taillights faded into the encroaching darkness, I realized he was alone. No passenger, no wife. I remained crouched in the corn for what felt like an eternity. My shoulders burned with tension, and my breath was coming in shaky bursts. Finally, the last glow of sunset was nearly gone, replaced by the onset of a starry night. The fields around me sank into darkness, and the only illumination was faint moonlight and the occasional flicker of starlight reflecting off the river. I remained crouched in the corn for what felt like an eternity. My shoulders burned with tension, and my breath was coming in shaky bursts. Finally, the last glow of sunset was nearly gone, replaced by the onset of a starry night. The fields around me sank into darkness, and the only illumination was faint moonlight and the occasional flicker of starlight reflecting off the river. I forced my stiff body to move. I had to get back to my Jeep fast. Every crunch of dry leaves under my boots echoed in my ears. The scene played over in my head, the stench, the blood-stained shirt, his crazed expression. My skin crawled with the memory. I reached the river's edge once more, found the path, and followed it upstream, all the while glancing over my shoulder, rifle at the ready. In the distance, coyotes howled, their eerie voices drifting over the farmland. The temperature was dropping, and I shivered violently, unable to tell if it was from the cold or the leftover panic. After what felt like an hour, but was likely just 10 or 15 minutes, I spotted my Jeep, a silent guardian beneath the silhouettes of cottonwoods. Leaping inside, I slammed the doors, locked them, and turned the ignition. The engine purred to life, its familiar rumble a balm to my frayed nerves. Headlights cut through the gloom, illuminating swirling dust motes and the thick trunks of the trees. I half expected that white car to suddenly appear, roaring out of the darkness to block my way, but there was nothing. Only an empty dirt track leading me back toward the main road. 6. Nighttime fears. The drive home was a blur of trembling hands on the steering wheel and frantic eyes scanning the rearview mirror. Every moment I expected to see those headlights tailing me. The dirt road gave way to a narrower county road, and eventually I turned onto the highway, leading into our tiny town. Relief began to edge in, at least among houses and streetlights. I'd have a better chance of calling for help if needed. My mind spiraled with questions. Who was he? What was he doing on my grandmother's land, ranting about a wife that might not have existed? How long had he been there? And did he mean me harm? Or was it just a deranged outburst? The memory of his twisted face flashed through my thoughts, that twisted half-snarl, half-crooked grin, the dried blood on his shirt, the monstrous stench. As soon as I pulled into our driveway, I bolted out of the Jeep and into the house. Brandon was in the living room, hunched over his laptop, eyes flicking up as I rushed through the door. When he saw the state of me, his face drained of color. "What happened?" he asked, leaping up so quickly he knocked over an empty coffee mug. I tried to speak but only managed to stammer out partial phrases. My heart was still pounding, adrenaline thundering through my veins. Brandon guided me to the couch, sat next to me, and gently took the rifle from my shaking hands. It took a few minutes of slow breathing, of focusing on the steady ring of the overhead light, before I could finally recount the entire encounter. He listened, eyes wide, face grim. When I finished, we both sat in stunned silence for a moment. The normal hum of our quiet household felt alien. Our black cat padded across the living room floor, tail flicking with curiosity, as though sensing the tension in the air. "Are you hurt?" Brandon asked, gently placing a hand on my knee. "Are you hurt?" Brandon asked, gently placing a hand on my knee. I shook my head. "No, I'm okay, just, he was so close, and he was huge. You said he had a club?" His tone was a mix of disbelief and anger. "Yeah," I nodded, swallowing hard. "Filthy clothes, stained with something. Possibly blood. And he smelled horrible." Brandon exhaled slowly, color high in his cheeks. "We're calling the sheriff right now. I don't care if you didn't get a plate number. We can't just let this go." I nodded gratefully. Part of me was still scared he might show up again, and perhaps the sheriff would at least sweep the area. 7. A sheriff's visit. We contacted the local sheriff's department. Given that our town was so small, we all knew the deputies by name. It was after dark at this point, but dispatch connected us with the on-duty sheriff, a gruff man named Sheriff Malik. He arrived at our house with 2 deputies in tow, men I recognized from the monthly town meetings. They sat at our kitchen table, notepads ready, listening as I told my story again, this time with every detail I could recall. They asked me to describe the man, his height, approximate weight, hair color, any scars or tattoos, the slur in his speech. I told them I estimated him at around 6'5", broad-shouldered, possibly in his late 40s or 50s. I mentioned the blood-stained, torn shirt, the streaks of filth, the horrifying odor. And you say he got into a small two-door white car with California plates? Sheriff Malik repeated, scratching notes. You sure about that? I hesitated. I'm positive it was a white car, 2 doors. The license plates definitely said California, but I couldn't make out the numbers. He tapped the pen against his notepad, frowning. We don't get many out-of-state visitors this time of year, especially from California. Could be a drifter passing through. Brandon tensed next to me. That drifter threatened my wife with a giant branch. She had to aim a rifle at him to stop him from coming closer. One of the deputies nodded solemnly. We understand. We'll go out there tonight, see if he's still lurking around. I couldn't shake the lingering dread. He said he was hunting with his wife, who apparently missed a big buck. But I saw no one else. He sounded not all there. I wonder if there even was a wife. Sheriff Malik exchanged glances with his deputies. We'll find out. Let's head over to the farm, see what we can turn up. You two should stay here. Brendan nodded. I'll come out tomorrow, help you look if you need me. No need. We'll update you if we find anything. The officers left, their headlights disappearing into the night. I sat there with Brandon for a long time, drained from the entire experience. He tried to comfort me, but my mind kept replaying the vivid image of the stranger's face, that unhinged fury in his eyes. 8. The haystack aftermath. The next morning, we got a call from Sheriff Malik. He asked us to come out to the haystack with him, that they'd found something. A knot formed in my stomach, but I agreed, feeling an odd sense of responsibility. Brendan and I drove out in the Jeep following a winding dirt road that cut through neighboring properties until it intersected with the farmland near the giant haystack. The place looked different in daylight, less menacing, but the memory of the previous evening clung to my senses like a stubborn shadow. The cornstalk still rustled in a gentle breeze, and the sunlight gleamed off the tall bales of alfalfa stacked near the barn. Sheriff Malik's cruiser was parked near the haystack, lights off, 2 deputies nearby scanning the ground. As soon as Brandon and I stepped out, Malik walked up, raising a small plastic evidence bag. Inside lay a large hunting knife, its handle wrapped in old electrical tape. The blade was stained with rust, and possibly something else dried to its surface. We found this near some fresh tire tracks, Malik said, voice low. It's likely where your friend with the white car was parked. Doesn't look like a normal piece of equipment you use out here for farm work. A shiver slid down my spine. So he dropped it? Or someone dropped it? Hard to say if it's been here for days or just last night. He frowned. No footprints besides yours, his, and ours. The ground's too dry beyond a few spots for clear impressions. Tire tracks match a smaller passenger vehicle, but that's about all we can confirm. Brandon's gaze hardened. So no one knows who he is. Great. Given you didn't get the plate number, Malik said, and we have no idea who this man might be, there's not much more we can do. We'll keep our eyes open for a vehicle matching your description. If he's still in the area, we'll find him. Frustration gnawed at me. He threatened me. Isn't there anything else you can do? If we had a name or a positive ID, maybe, Malik said gently. Right now, all we can do is log the complaint, keep patrols up, and watch for suspicious vehicles. You said he had a mental break of some kind, or at least that's how it looked. We'll notify the other departments around us to keep an eye out. My eyes drifted to the patch of dirt where I guessed he'd stood. I recalled the stink of him, the madness in his eyes. I'm worried he'll come back, Malik nodded solemnly. We'll keep watch. In the meantime, you folks stay armed if you're out here. Don't come alone. Keep your phone charged. Check for signal as soon as you can. He jerked a thumb at my husband. You should accompany her if she needs to finish out the hunt. Malik nodded solemnly. We'll keep watch. In the meantime, you folks stay armed if you're out here. Don't come alone. Keep your phone charged. Check for signal as soon as you can. He jerked a thumb at my husband. You should accompany her if she needs to finish out the hunt. Brandon nodded, slipping an arm around my shoulders. I won't let her come out here alone again. I stared once more at the large knife inside the evidence bag, an unsettling swirl in my stomach. That thing belonged to him, or someone like him, and it was right next to where he'd parked his car. The cold reality set in. If he'd caught up to me in the corn before I confronted him, if he'd had that knife. 9. Rumors and restlessness. In a place as small as ours, word travels fast. By the next day, half the town had heard whispers of a stranger who threatened me while hunting. At the local diner, the older residents speculated about a crazy vagrant or escaped convict. One woman claimed she saw a white car flying down the old highway outside town, heading southeast. Another man thought he'd noticed someone rummaging in a vacant barn near the orchard the week before, though details were hazy. My grandmother was horrified when I told her the story. She insisted I hunt only in broad daylight if I wanted to continue using her land, and to bring at least one person with me. She even offered to sit at the farmhouse while I hunted, so she could keep an eye on the perimeter. The care in her voice both soothed and unsettled me. It was a stark reminder that I was no longer safe, even in the place I'd known my entire life. Despite the swirling rumors, no one had a clear lead. A few folks had indeed spotted a beat-up white sedan with California plates in passing, but it was always at a distance. Nobody recognized the driver, and nobody had any idea where he might have gone after that terrifying encounter. Over the next week, I tried to continue my normal routine. I still went to work at the local clinic, still dropped by the grocery store where Brandon worked part-time, still visited friends after hours, but the slightest noise made me jump. I checked windows, kept my rifle close. Whenever I was home alone at night, I sometimes dreamed of that man in the field, hearing his rasping breath in the darkness outside my bedroom window. Brandon tried to be comforting, but I could see worried lines etched on his face. He'd ask me if I wanted to practice shooting with him, just to be sure I felt prepared. I'd refuse politely, not wanting to feed my own paranoia. Secretly, I was grateful I hadn't had to pull the trigger that night. Yet, I couldn't stop wondering if letting him go had been a mistake. What if he hurt someone else? 10. One last trip. Before the first week of October ended, I still had that buck tag burning a hole in my pocket. We rely heavily on wild game to fill our freezer every year, so I decided I couldn't let fear rob me of the chance to stock up. Brandon, determined to keep me safe, insisted on coming along. We drove out in the early morning light, wanting to hunt during the safest hours, full daylight, with plenty of time to get home before dusk. Before the first week of October ended, I still had that buck tag burning a hole in my pocket. We rely heavily on wild game to fill our freezer every year, so I decided I couldn't let fear rob me of the chance to stock up. Brandon, determined to keep me safe, insisted on coming along. We drove out in the early morning light, wanting to hunt during the safest hours, full daylight, with plenty of time to get home before dusk. Stepping onto my grandmother's farm, the morning was surreal. The sun rose, golden beams, piercing the thin morning haze, illuminating the rows of alfalfa and the looming corn. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster crowed, and crows cawed from the treetops. It was the same peaceful farmland I knew, yet I couldn't shake the memory of that malevolent presence. Brandon and I made our way carefully toward the fields. The dew-laden grass dampened our boots. We paused at the haystack, the same place I'd seen the stranger, and found no sign of him. The dry, dusty ground still bore faint tire marks, but there was no way to tell how old they were. My husband rested a hand on my shoulder, giving me a reassuring squeeze. We set up near the tree line, scanning the edges with binoculars, looking for deer. An uneasy hush seemed to settle around us. The farmland's typical morning chorus, chirping songbirds, rustling leaves, felt distant. Even with Brandon by my side, an undercurrent of fear pulsed through me. Hours passed, the sun climbed higher, and there was not a single sign of a buck. Usually, we'd see at least a few does or small bucks crossing into the alfalfa, but the field seemed barren. It was as if the wildlife had sensed the danger too. By late morning, we decided to move closer to the corn, hoping to catch deer that might be lying low. We advanced slowly, scanning every direction. My stomach fluttered each time I peered into those tall cornstalks, half expecting to see a dark silhouette lurking within, half expecting to smell that foul odor. But there was nothing, only the faint, earthy scent of damp soil. Finally, around midday, we spotted a decent 4-point buck stepping cautiously from the corn into the alfalfa. Brandon signaled for me to get ready. I braced against a fence post, exhaled slowly, and fired a single shot. The buck dropped cleanly. Relief and pride momentarily surged through me, overshadowing my lingering anxiety. We took our time field dressing, constantly glancing over our shoulders. Despite the bright sunlight, I felt as though the farmland held its breath, an ominous quiet in the air. When we finished, we hauled the meat back to the Jeep, the heavy game bag straining our shoulders. As we lifted the last bag into the vehicle, Brandon locked eyes with me. "Let's get out of here," he muttered. "This place is giving me the creeps." I couldn't have agreed more. 11. Fading footsteps. The autumn days rolled on, and I never saw that tall stranger again. The next week, hunting season ended, and the farm stood silent. My grandmother insisted on installing a new lock on her barn doors and encouraged other relatives to keep watch if they visited. The sheriff did. Occasional drive-bys, but as weeks passed, the stranger's specter faded from the minds of many. Life resumed its small-town rhythm, but the memory never fully left me. At night, especially when Brandon worked late shifts, I'd find myself lying in bed, covers pulled tight, listening to every creak of the house. Shadows on the wall seemed to stretch into menacing shapes. Sometimes, I startled awake from nightmares of a half-mad face emerging from the corn, stick raised to strike. Each time, I'd remind myself I'd been quick enough, armed enough, lucky enough, but fear sank claws into my psyche, whispering that next time, I might not be so fortunate. At night, especially when Brandon worked late shifts, I'd find myself lying in bed, covers pulled tight, listening to every creak of the house. Shadows on the wall seemed to stretch into menacing shapes. Sometimes, I startled awake from nightmares of a half-mad face emerging from the corn, stick raised to strike. Each time, I'd remind myself I'd been quick enough, armed enough, lucky enough, but fear sank claws into my psyche, whispering that next time, I might not be so fortunate. Curiosity drove me to check the local news, scouring for reports of a tall, disheveled man or a suspicious white sedan. Apart from the occasional petty theft or bar fight, there was nothing. No mention of an arrest, no mug shots that matched. For all I knew, he'd vanished into the highways, drifting on to his next stop. But I couldn't help feeling he'd left a piece of himself behind, an echo of menace that clung to the farmland. 12. The Unwanted Legend. Over the months and years that followed, the story of my encounter gradually took on life of its own. Locals would whisper about it around bonfires, near the edge of the fields at night, turning the man into a kind of boogeyman. Some swore they heard him watering the riverbanks at dusk, calling out for his wife. Others claimed to have seen a white car parked on the outskirts of farmland, but upon investigation, it was always gone. When children misbehaved, a few parents even joked darkly, "Better behave, or the cornfield. Drifter will snatch you." The casual ease with which they used the story as a cautionary tale only fueled my lingering anxiety. I hated the idea that my harrowing experience had become town lore, exaggerated and reshaped until the real terror of that night was lost in rumor and theatrics. Yet as the season cycled, fewer people brought it up. Some of the older folks forgot the details or blended them into other legends of the area. Strange sightings of black-eyed animals, rumored hauntings in abandoned barns, random footprints in dusty roads. Life here has a way of absorbing events, filing them away under small town mysteries, and continuing on. 13. Fragments of memory. Despite the passage of time, I never truly shook the fear. Each October, when the leaves turned golden and the air grew crisp, I felt the knot in my stomach return. Hunting had once been my sanctuary, a quiet communion with nature, a link to my heritage. After that night, I only hunted with a partner, Brandon or my grandfather, or even a close friend who enjoyed the sport. I refused to step foot on those fields alone at twilight again. Sometimes, I'd find myself staring at the cornstalks, if we passed them on a drive or if I stood on the porch of my grandmother's farmhouse. I'd remember the stench, the insane glint in that stranger's eyes, his towering figure as he brandished the makeshift club. I'd wonder if I should have questioned him more, if I should have insisted on helping him find his supposed wife, assuming she even existed, or if I should have forced him at gunpoint to give me his name and license plate. But at the time, my fear was too great, my mind too focused on surviving that immediate threat. Brandon tried to comfort me with logic. "There's no sign he ever came back. He probably drove off, realized how lucky he was not to get shot, and never looked back." While that soothed me momentarily, I couldn't rid myself of the nagging sense that people like that don't just quietly fade away. Danger can slip under the radar, lying dormant. Then, when you least expect it, it emerges again. Brandon tried to comfort me with logic. "There's no sign he ever came back. He probably drove off, realized how lucky he was not to get shot, and never looked back." While that soothed me momentarily, I couldn't rid myself of the nagging sense that people like that don't just quietly fade away. Danger can slip under the radar, lying dormant. Then, when you least expect it, it emerges again. 14. 8 years later. Time rolled on. We lived our lives, endured harsh winters, joyous springs, sweltering summers, and crisp falls. Family gatherings filled the farmhouse. New nephews and nieces were born, and the farmland witnessed countless sunrises and sunsets without incident. 8 years after that horrifying evening, the memory still chilled me. On the anniversary, I couldn't help recalling the feeling of hiding in those cornstalks, listening to his furious footfalls crushing leaves and husks, the wild cursing echoing through the field. I found myself telling the story again to a new friend who'd moved to town, a cautionary tale of why one should never hunt alone and always trust their gut. She listened, wide-eyed and silent, gripping her coffee mug as I relayed every detail. My voice wavered despite the distance of time. At the end, she asked, "Did you ever find out who he was? What he was doing out there?" I shook my head. "No. The sheriff never found him, and we haven't heard from him since. No one recognized him. It remains a mystery." Though the fear had faded, replaced by an uneasy acceptance, it never truly left. There are nights when I glance out the window and imagine a tall silhouette standing by the fence, waiting, the stink of decay wafting on the breeze. Sometimes I imagine that white car, creeping down our quiet road, headlights off, searching for me. Of course, no such figure appears. My rational mind knows he's gone. Still, my instincts keep me vigilant. 15. Lingering shadows. There is a kind of solace in the farmland's unchanging rhythms. The corn is planted in spring, grows tall in summer, is harvested in fall. The cycle repeats year after year, oblivious to the nightmares etched in my memory. Life is steady here, predictable. That, in its own way, is healing. Time may not erase the past, but it cushions it, layers it beneath day-to-day routines. I learned to take comfort in those routines, waking up early to tend to the animals, chatting with my grandmother about the yield, canning vegetables for winter storage, preparing the house for the cold months. Yet every October, when the rifles come out and deer tags are pinned to the fridge, I remember the day my world cracked open. I remember the feeling that my safe haven could harbor a monster, that the place I knew so intimately could still hide something so wrong. The farmland had been my cradle, my playground, my training ground, and for a few terrifying moments, it became my prison. The only solace I found was in my own strength, that despite my terror, I stood my ground, aimed my rifle, and survived. Maybe that was the lesson hidden in the horror, and understanding that even in the face of evil, we can stand firm. Or maybe it was just a freak occurrence, a twist of bad luck that collided our paths. In any case, I learned that vigilance is essential. Trust your gut. Know your surroundings. Never assume you're alone in the dark. The only solace I found was in my own strength, that despite my terror, I stood my ground, aimed my rifle, and survived. Maybe that was the lesson hidden in the horror, and understanding that even in the face of evil, we can stand firm. Or maybe it was just a freak occurrence, a twist of bad luck that collided our paths. In any case, I learned that vigilance is essential. Trust your gut. Know your surroundings. Never assume you're alone in the dark. 16. A final word. Sometimes, I find myself replaying the confrontation in my mind, changing small details, wondering, what if? What if I'd run instead of stepping out? Would he have found me in the corn and attacked from behind? What if I had shot him as soon as he lunged at me? Could I have ended someone's life that night? Would that have protected future victims or robbed me of my own peace forever? There are no satisfying answers, only speculation. What I do know is that the farmland remains, my grandmother's legacy endures, and people still hunt there every season without trouble, at least none that we've heard of. Over the years, I've grown more cautious, but I refuse to let that single encounter destroy the connection I have to my family's land. That's my home. Fear may grip me at times, but it hasn't won. And as for that tall, filthy man with a crooked face and dried blood on his shirt, I hope our paths never cross again. Part of me wonders if he's still alive, roaming rural backroads, chasing illusions of a wife and a buck that never existed. Or maybe he found another place to haunt, another farm to intrude upon, another unsuspecting victim to terrorize. I'll never know. All I can say with certainty is that on that autumn evening in 2016, the farmland revealed a darkness I'd never imagined, a reminder that even in the safest corners of the world, menace can lurk. And though 8 years have passed, the echo of his voice remains lodged in my memory, a low snarl reverberating under a fiery October sky, reminding me that true terror can walk right into your life without warning. And when it does, all you can do is fight to keep breathing, hold your ground, and pray your last breath isn't wasted on a screen. Author's note: it has been 8 years since that fateful day, and I still wonder about the man who invaded my grandmother's farm. His intentions remain unknown, whether it was simple violence, mental instability, or some darker motive. The possibilities chill me. But in a small town, legends grow, and sometimes they fade. The farmland, as always, stands resolute, witnessing our fears and our triumphs alike. It carries on beneath sunrises and sunsets, impervious to the human dramas that play out among its rows. And so, life continues, with a rifle in my hand whenever I wander those fields, and the unshakable memory of a stranger's cursed threats echoing in my mind. That night taught me vigilance. It taught me that while rural life can be peaceful, it's never immune to horror. In the end, it taught me that we're always more vulnerable than we'd like to believe, and sometimes the scariest stories don't come from fiction, but from real life in the place you call home. Subscribe to my YouTube channel. Don't forget to like and click the bell.